One of South Africa's biggest pharmacy groups, Dis-chem, saw an increase in its annual profits. The company benefited from various acquisitions of new smaller pharmacies and a stronger demand for medicines as COVID-19 lockdown restrictions have been reduced. We've got Rui Morais, who is the CFO at Dis-chem, joins us now for more on the company's numbers. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Rui. So I guess one of the first things we have to unpack here is that have consumers gone back to the items that they were buying before COVID? I mean, has this been reflected in the set of numbers you put out on Sense today?
Evening, and it has to a certain degree. I do think we are seeing normalized trading patterns coming back into our numbers. That being said, it's not at the exact levels that we saw pre-COVID, but we're certainly seeing some anecdotal evidence of that return. So if you look at kind of basket mix, you're seeing shopping in much higher beauty margins, for example. You're also seeing the frequency of traffic increase, so consumers are coming into our environments a lot more. You're seeing higher growth rates in our mall stores, which is a dynamic that has changed, in the last 6 months in terms of our malls are being frequented, which wasn't the case when people were shopping in convenience centers only. So there are indications that we're seeing normalized trading patterns, but there's still some way to go before we get to pre-COVID levels.
And that's an important point to say, that there's still a way to go, because you were trading in conditions that included the violent unrest we saw in July and just a tough operating environment given what we're seeing with the economy.
That's true. I mean, I think these last 2 years have been incredibly unpredictable from a landscape perspective. Very difficult to predict or manage or plan for situations like that. So as dynamic as the landscape is, so you have to mitigate it and plan for it. I mean, we're looking forward to some sort of normality as we trade into the next financial year. And just to ensure that we bed down some of our recent acquisitions, we think there's huge opportunity in each and every one of them. So looking forward to that as opposed to navigating the last 2 years, which have been a challenge. But at the same time, I think the group has done well, and we now navigate a new challenge, which is a highly constrained consumer, and I think that's quite evident from our kind of outlook.
I want to move on to some other matters, but before we do, I just want to touch one more point on the acquisitions that you have been making as a business. Are we going to be seeing more, or are you now going to focus on growing the ones that you have just acquired?
So difficult to say you won't see more. I think, naturally the business is relatively entrepreneurial, and I think any opportunity that comes across our table, we'd obviously have to look at, if it's in line with our strategic ambitions. But in saying that, it was a coincidence that the acquisitions all landed, at very similar times. They were strategic direction that we took a couple of years ago in terms of how we wanted the group to grow and in what direction. So certainly the year ahead and potentially the year thereafter is going to be a year where we bed down those acquisitions and we look for the returns that we had seen originally in those assets.
Absolutely. Now, we saw that you have been rather reluctant to share some information about the recent data breach that you had, but there are some members of the public who are still concerned about what was compromised, if anything was. Do we have an update on that?
Sure. So, I mean, as we said in our press release, and as we said in terms of communication by our website, which is required from a regulatory perspective, the information leaked was non-financial, non-medical, and also didn't contain any ID numbers. So it was really around name, surname, and contactability. Our response, albeit that it was one of our service providers, is to continue to monitor the controls that each of our service providers have in place. We've obviously launched an internal audit to make sure that those controls, that our service providers ensure exist are not only self-attestation in terms of how they come back to us, but at the same time they're auditable. So that's a process that we're running internally, and we'll continue to hold the data in terms of the controls that we have as safely as possible. The reality is that there are many instances of South African corporations that will go through this. I mean, this won't be the first, it won't be the last. And I think as consumers, we also need to be cautious of the engagements that we have, from in instances of or individuals or organizations that potentially have access to our data.